This entry takes us back to February of 1999, where a group of 3 decided to take a trip to Yosemite National Park. They were 42-year-old Carol Sund, her daughter 16-year-old Julie, and Julie's friend Silvina Peloso, who is a 16-year-old exchange student from Argentina. Carol and Julie wanted to make the most of the brief amount of time Silvina had to stay in the US, so the two discussed potential things to do and places to visit, not entirely sure which they should pick. In the end, they agreed that visiting the Yosemite National Park would be an amazing experience for everyone. But before they stopped by Yosemite, they first visited a number of other locations throughout California so Silvina could take in the sights. When they completed their list of other places to visit, the trio stopped by a motel located right outside the national park. The motel is known as Cedar Lodge. When the group was settled, they spent that day and the next exploring the park, taking pictures, and just enjoying each other's company. When it was getting late and dark on February 15th, the group decided to head back to their motel room and get some rest before heading back to the airport the next morning to return home. To add to the colorful collection of photos they had taken, Julie wanted to get a picture of her mom and Silvina. What you see on screen is that picture Julie took. Shortly after taking it, tragedy would strike. About 2 years before Carol, Julie, and Silvina made this trip to the Yosemite National Park, a man named Cary Stayner applied for a position at the Cedar Lodge Motel, and he got hired as a handyman. Now, what exactly is Cary's relevance to this story, you may ask? Well, he kills Carol, Julie, and Silvina shortly after Julie had taken that picture I showed you earlier. Or rather, he killed Carol and Silvina, then ran off with Julie as he had much darker plans for her. Cary had walked up to the room the 3 were staying in and knocked on the door, stating that there were several issues with the bathroom. Obviously, it's not really people's first thought that they are at the threat of a killer, so Carol allowed Cary in. He said thanks and that he would be out in just a moment. He walks over to the bathroom with his tools and emerges shortly after. However, he had a firearm pointed at the group. Cary threatened them all, ordering them to stay silent. He told them that he was simply after their money and valuables, and as soon as he got them, he'd be on his way and their lives would be spared. Everyone complies, and Cary motions for them to move over as he grabs his duct tape to tie them all up. Once everyone was immobilized, he then took the lives of Carol and Silvina, but left Julie alive. He had no intentions on keeping anyone alive for very long, and he couldn't care less about that money. Instead, he had a carnal desire that he wanted to satiate. One after the other, Cary tossed Carol and Silvina into the trunk of the rental car Carol had been driving. Then he tossed Julie into the front of the car where he could keep an eye on her. Not like she was in any position to struggle anyway. Fast forward the next day, February 16th, Carol and the girls were supposed to check out of the motel and start their drive to the airport, but they never checked out. And back home, Carol's husband, Jens, was waiting to pick up the group from the airport. They never showed up. He tried calling Carol several times, but every single attempt failed. Jens then suspected something bad had happened, but at first he thought that maybe they had simply gotten lost. So he called authorities and informed them that his wife, daughter, and one of her daughter's friends had likely gotten lost in the woods of Yosemite National Park. This information was relayed down to a station closer to the park, and a search party was sent out to investigate and hopefully find the group. Investigators interviewed people at the motel and other hikers, asking if anyone had seen Carol or the girls. And while there were a number of people who did see them, no one really had any valuable information in terms of where they could be. So the search parties continued to comb the wilderness, and they eventually made a discovery. Someone had found Carol's wallet. However, it was found in a completely different location. The wallet was found in Modesto, which was west of the park by about 90 to 100 miles, depending on which route you took. At this point, some suspected that maybe the group wasn't simply lost in the forest. Maybe they had been abducted or worse, killed, and the person had passed through Modesto. The search continued, and hope of even finding the 3 was starting to fade. But then on March 18th, another discovery was made. Carol's rental car was found. But there was an issue, a major issue. The car had been completely burned. The car was found in Stanislaus National Forest, which was north of the motel where Carol, Julie, and Silvina were staying at. This obviously confused investigators even more. Carol's wallet was found towards the west, while her car was found north and in the middle of the forest. It was becoming more and more clear that this was the act of someone with cruel intentions. A group of searchers set out from the location of the vehicle in search of Carol, but right as they were leaving, another person discovers the charred remains of not only Carol, Carol, but Sylvina as well. Both of them had been found inside the trunk of the car. At this point, it was obvious that foul play was involved, but the search was not yet over. Julie was still missing, and authorities held out hope that she was still out there and alive. The story about these remains found in that charred vehicle quickly spread, which led to an interesting letter. Police had received a handwritten note with a crudely drawn map and the phrase, "We had fun with this one," scrawled at the top, and you can probably take an accurate wild guess at who wrote and sent it. Authorities visited the location that was shared on the note, and when they got there, they indeed found the remains of Julie Sund with the use of a search dog. Medical officials shared that she had been and died as a result of a neck wound caused by a knife. They had also shared that while Carol had been strangled to death, Sylvina had been shot, and just like Julie, Sylvina had also been prior to her death. Authorities retraced their steps and went back to the Cedar Lodge motel to thoroughly interview all of the staff, asking if they had seen anything or anyone that was suspicious. And amongst those that were interviewed was Cary Stayner himself. Police shared that at no point did anyone suspect him of being the culprit. He came across as a totally normal man. They revisited Modesto since Carol's wallet was found there, however, this was simply a red herring placed by Cary. I'm not sure about now, but at the time, Modesto was known for its criminal population. Almost everywhere you went in Modesto, there were offenders and illegal substance dealers. Cary knew this and thought that if he placed a wallet there, police would be more likely to assume that the killer was also in that location. As leads dried up, investigators thought to themselves, is it possible that the culprit was actually already behind bars for a different crime? And they were actually convinced of this and gave up on the search, believing the killer was already apprehended. But fast forward to July, they would be in for a rude awakening. The headless remains of a young woman named Joey Armstrong were found in the Yosemite National Park. This discovery pulled investigators back into reality. Carol, Julie, and Sylvina's killer was still out there. Just a day earlier, July 21st, Joey's friends had reported her missing after she failed to meet them for a hiking trip. Joey's body was found less than a mile from her cabin in the park. Investigators had stumbled upon it near a small stream after they were informed of Joey's disappearance by her friends. What had happened here is that Cary was wandering the woods and accidentally encountered Joey's cabin. Realizing that she was living all alone, he saw a perfect opportunity to strike. You see, Cary actually frequently went out and wandered the wilderness and indulged in a variety of substances. He had ambushed Joey and threatened her with a firearm before tying her up. Based on the area around where Joey was found, investigators believed that there was an intense struggle, so they proposed the possibility that Joey had actually escaped from Cary after she was tied up in his truck. But she didn't get far before Cary caught up and took her life. According to some anonymous hikers, Cary's truck had been seen in the area of Joey's cabin, so police went over to the Cedar Lodge in order to talk to Cary. However, he wasn't there. Strange, as he was said to never be late or miss a day at work. Just days later, police received a tip on Cary's whereabouts. Two police officers headed over to a nudist resort called Laguna del Sol, which was located northwest of the park, and it's there where police easily found and apprehended Cary. When officials went up to the front desk and showed a picture of Cary, they easily pointed him out in a tent, saying he's the only guy here with clothes on. In his possession, authorities found what they called a murder kit, basically just a combination of supplies that a killer would need. And now I'd like to take a look into Cary's past, as it is very interesting. And trust me, you'll want to stick around and listen to the entire thing. Cary Stayner had a brother named Stephen. Stephen had actually been kidnapped by a man named Kenneth Parnell in December of 1972 in Merced, California. Kenneth had recruited a man named Irvin Murphy to help him find and capture new targets. One target he had been eyeing was Stephen. So after studying Stephen's daily routine, he set in motion a plan after Stephen left school. Irvin waited for him and handed him a religious flyer, claiming to be a representative of the local church. Stephen said that he was just a kid that didn't really have anything to donate to the church. But obviously, Irvin didn't care about that and asked if his family could donate instead. Stephen said yeah, his mom probably could. Irvin said that was great and asked the boy where he lived. After sharing his address, Irvin invited him into a white Buick driven by Kenneth, and the two headed over to Stephen's house. Not really. Instead, Stephen was taken to a secret cabin of Kenneth's. The whole drive, Stephen was confused and frequently told Irvin that they were not going in the right direction. At some point, Kenneth told Stephen that his parents could no longer afford him, so they gave him custody of Stephen. And days after being abducted, Kenneth started to rape the boy. He gave him a new name as well, Dennis Parnell. And Kenneth, who now pretended to be his father, actually went out of his way to enroll him in schools over the following years. Kenneth also allowed his friends and acquaintances to take advantage of Stephen. As Stephen got older and his body began to mature, Kenneth was no longer attracted to him, and thus he began scouting for a new victim. Similar to Irvin all those years ago, Kenneth now had Stephen fulfill the role of luring people to him. On February 14th, 1980, Kenneth and Stephen had set in motion a plan to kidnap a 5-year-old boy in Utah. However, Stephen actually returned the child to his parents instead of following through with Kenneth's plan. On March 1st, when Kenneth had a night shift, Stephen took the 5-year-old and left. The two went to a police station, and the very next day, authorities arrested Kenneth. Stephen and the other boy were finally returned to their loving families, and for Stephen, it was about 7 years where he had been locked away and abused. I've spent a lot of time on Cary's brother by now, so I don't want to drag this out too much longer, but long story short, Kenneth only received a 7-year prison sentence before later being convicted for other crimes in the mid-2000s, landing him a 25 to life sentence. He ended up dying in 2008. So now with all of that out of the way, what is the significance of Stephen in Cary's life? Well, Cary was scarred by Stephen's kidnapping. Prior to Stephen's disappearance, Cary was a normal person with a good temperament, but after Stephen was kidnapped, you'll see that in a lot of photos of Cary during that period, he is actually wearing a hat. This was because he had uncontrollable urges to rip out his hair in frustration and despair over his brother, and in order to cope with these feelings, he did some strange and things. He was also said to lash out violently at times for reasons that were seemingly meaningless. Fast forward to when Stephen returned to his family, everyone, including Cary, were ecstatic. However, Cary quickly grew to resent Stephen. Understandably, after getting one of their kids back, the stayner parents gave Stephen a lot more attention. Cary felt as though he was being completely ignored. Additionally, Stephen was viewed as a hero by the public for saving that 5-year-old. There were even documentary-type movies and books that were made on Stephen for this courageous act. Cary grew envious and wanted his own movie. In later interviews, Cary said that one of the major reasons he even committed these acts of violence in the first place was in hopes that someone would create a movie about him, similar to Stephen. In September of 1989, Stephen Stayner actually died as a result of a motorcycle accident, specifically a hit-and-run event. The person responsible was later found, but they only received a 3-month prison sentence. And amongst those that appeared at Stephen's funeral was that little boy he saved who was a teen at this point. So anyway, to some, Stephen's kidnapping is viewed as sort of the event that started Cary's downward spiral. After being arrested, Cary told police that he wanted to hurt people for a very long time, and Carol, Julie, Sylvina, and Joey were simply at the wrong place at the wrong time. He didn't care who his target was, but he did prefer if they were female. In Cary's possession, investigators found these recordings that he took before and after the victims' deaths, and in all of those recordings, he's completely emotionless. I tried playing around with it so that I can play the recording for you all here, but no matter how I messed around with it, it kept getting picked up for age restriction. So if you are curious, feel free to search it up yourself, it's very easy to find. Ultimately, Cary pleaded not guilty. His attorneys tried to get him a lighter sentence by arguing that he was insane. They called back to the period in which Stephen had been kidnapped, saying that it caused permanent damage to him psychologically, and that violence was simply a means for him to vent and release the pain he was going through. There was even this moment that Cary said he would confess to all 4 murders if he was given explicit material involving minors, which is just a crazy thing to say. I don't know if he was actually expecting to get something out of that, but he was sentenced to death in 2002 and he is currently on death row. This next entry takes us over to Indonesia in March of 2017. There was a young man, aged 25, named Akbar Saliburo who lived in a village on the island called Sulawesi. Akbar spent his days gathering palm fruit from these large trees with a long pole that had this sort of hook at the end. On March 25th, Akbar worked for a longer period than usual. Several of his family members were out, so Akbar wouldn't have anything to do back home if he left the fruit trees early. So he stayed later and worked into the night. And if you're not aware, there are some crazy animals in Indonesia and their pythons are massive. They can grow upwards of 20 feet. Usually, Akbar would work alongside some other people in the area, but again, this time around, Akbar worked much later, so everyone had left the area. This paired alongside all of the cover that nature provided allowed for a massive python to sneak up on him. With precision, power, and speed, it locked its mouth onto Akbar and coiled its body around him, and it's chalked at this point, especially since Akbar was all alone. The python's mouth expanded and Akbar was completely consumed. His family returned home later and were confused to see that he wasn't there. Believing that he was simply out working late, which he was, Akbar's family just went to sleep. The next day, Akbar was still nowhere to be seen, and when his co-workers started arriving at the forest to harvest palm fruit, they too started asking each other if anyone had seen Akbar. But nobody had, so authorities were contacted and a search for Akbar began. After learning from his family that he never returned on the night of the 25th, the search was focused in the forest where Akbar worked. After several hours of searching, there were finally signs of Akbar. A group of men had found one of his boots as well as that pole he carried to knock down palm fruit. However, nearby was something that really scared the group of men. There was this huge trail, and of course locals immediately knew what left it. They feared that Akbar had been attacked by a massive python. The search groups came together and started focusing down the path of that python trail, and it didn't take long for them to find a huge 300-pound python that was really misshapen. The group of men opened it up and right there just plopped out Akbar. I'm not going to show you the image of Akbar being removed for obvious reasons, but if you really want to see it, it's easily found on Google. The first image of it is already pretty messed up in my mind, and unfortunately Akbar was long gone by the time he was found. This final entry takes us over to Wales in the year 2010 with a 15-year-old girl named Rebecca Aylward. She had a boyfriend named Joshua Davies that she had met a couple of years ago around the age of 13. The two got to know each other really well and started a deeper relationship with each other at the age of 14. To all of Rebecca's friends and family, Joshua was a completely normal kid. He did have a hobby of collecting guns and knives, which worried Rebecca's sister. This concern then increased when Rebecca told her sister that Joshua, quote-unquote, playfully threatened her while holding one of his knives. Rebecca took it as a joke, but her sister thought that Joshua had some darker urges that he was holding back. After being together for several months, Rebecca asked her parents if Joshua could stay over at their house for a couple of days. Her parents were a bit skeptical, but in the end allowed him to stay over. Everyone said that they had a great time with each other's company, and Joshua seemed like a good kid. He was polite, outgoing, and had a good sense of humor. Joshua stayed at the Aylward residence for one weekend, and after saying his goodbyes to the family and returning home, he made a text. The message was sent to Rebecca, and it said that he wanted to break up. This text came as a complete shock. The relationship between the two seemed to be going smoothly, and Joshua was well liked by her family, and her family liked Joshua back. Just what caused this abrupt decision? Rebecca pushed back and asked why, but Joshua wouldn't reveal much, so all Rebecca could do was accept it. However, Joshua didn't leave her alone after the breakup. Strangely, he actually started to harass Rebecca. There were even rumors spreading around school saying that Rebecca was pregnant, rumors that were started by Joshua. Later reports from Joshua's friends even highlighted that he wanted to take Rebecca's life. This was a wild thing to say, and being teenagers, his friends thought that Joshua was just being edgy. One of his friends went along with what he thought was a joke and offered Joshua free breakfast if he went through with it. Luckily, there were some mutual friends between Rebecca and Joshua that told Joshua to stop. Nobody understood why he was being a bully. Joshua also started hanging out with this new girl, and when Rebecca saw the two, she simply thought that this was his new girlfriend. This was sort of enough for Rebecca to finally move on from Joshua, but of course deep down she did still have feelings for him because she never really got any closure on why the relationship ended. The school year eventually came to an end, and Joshua seemed to have moved on from Rebecca and rarely interacted with her. Even the bullying seemed to stop. Fast forward to the next school year, Joshua started to become interested in Rebecca once more. That girl that Joshua was seeing disappeared from his life as well, so on the surface, it seemed that he wanted to try building a relationship with Rebecca again. And as I said earlier, Rebecca still had feelings for Joshua, so she listened to almost anything he said. One day in late October 2010, Joshua asked Rebecca if she could visit the woods with him, and without any hesitation, Rebecca said yes. The two agreed to meet each other on the 23rd. That morning, Joshua was hanging out with some friends, and after checking the time, he got up from the table they were all sitting at and left. He was headed for the woods. Meanwhile, Rebecca was putting on makeup and deciding on which outfit to put on for what she thought was a date. Once she was all ready, she said her goodbyes to her family and headed out. Rebecca had told her mom about the meeting with Joshua, and she was also well aware of all the terrible things that he had said and done to Rebecca. So understandably, Rebecca's mother was worried about her. When Rebecca got to the woods, she received a phone call from her mother. She just wanted to make sure that Rebecca was alright and Joshua didn't have anything bad planned. Rebecca told her that Joshua hadn't arrived yet, so her mom stayed on the phone with her. A few minutes passed and Joshua showed up. Rebecca hung up the phone and the two walked deeper into the woods. Around this time, Joshua had also sent a text to a friend of his, and I have gotten like 4 to 5 different variations of what this text was, but it said something to the extent of, "I'll be expecting that breakfast soon." As the two walked deeper and deeper into the wilderness, Joshua eventually started trailing behind a little bit. He turned left to right and looked behind him to make sure that no one else was around. Then he bent over and picked up a rock and struck Rebecca with it. The two wrestled each other on the ground, and Rebecca was actually able to break free from Joshua and run off. However, Joshua was able to quickly recover and land the finishing blow before Rebecca could escape completely. Rebecca never returned home, so her mother suspected that Joshua really had done something terrible. Rebecca was reported missing, and her mother was able to get in touch with Joshua. She asked him if he knew where Rebecca was, and Joshua lied, saying that he had not seen her that day at all. He faked a concerned voice and said that he was at his grandma's the entire day. A couple of days would pass with no sign of Rebecca, and during that time, Joshua was sending texts to Rebecca's phone to sell the illusion that he had no idea where she was, but he was worried. One of Joshua's friends found out that Rebecca was missing, and he recalled all of the terrible things he did to Rebecca. This friend thought to himself, what are the chances that Joshua is actually responsible for her disappearance? Another student pointed out that Joshua had changed his profile picture on social media to this forested area nearby. Then others said that Joshua and Rebecca met at that same location in the profile picture. Several of Joshua's friends started connecting the dots and shared their thoughts with authorities. Investigators visited the woods, and indeed, they found Rebecca's remains. This photo is one of the last times that Joshua and Rebecca were seen together happy before Joshua ended up taking her life. And Joshua didn't really have a good reason for it. He did it just because he could. Ultimately, at Swansea Crown Court, he received a life sentence where he would have to serve a minimum of 14 in prison. Initially, Joshua actually denied being responsible. In fact, he tried to shift all of the blame to one of his friends. It was only about 8 years into his life sentence where he finally confessed.